At Thanksgiving, the smell of roasted turkey cinnamon pies and cranberry sauce filled every corner of the dining room, and the laughter of cousins echoed from the hallway as chairs scraped against the polished wooden floor. I had been up since dawn, basting the bird folding napkins into neat triangles and setting out my mother's old china because I wanted this holiday to be a bridge, not another battlefield. My name is Lydia, 28 years old, and this was the first time I hosted Thanksgiving for the entire family. I had polished every glass, lit every candle, and told myself maybe, just maybe, my father would finally look at me with pride. I carried the last tray of roasted vegetables out to the table, my palms trembling from exhaustion, but also from the weight of hope. My father Thomas rose from his chair at the head of the table, the same chair he had always claimed as a symbol of authority. In his hand was a glass of deep red wine that caught the reflection of the chandelier. For a heartbeat, I believed he was going to toast me, to thank me for the hours in the kitchen, to say something about how his youngest daughter had grown into a woman who could hold a family together. The room fell silent as everyone waited. Then he looked directly at me, his voice sharp enough to cut the air, and said, "Lydia, you are a disgrace." The words were not shouted, but they landed heavier than a scream. A gasp rippled across the table. Forks clattered against porcelain. My younger cousins froze with half-chewed rolls in their mouths. I felt the tray slipping from my hands, the metal hot against my skin, and for a terrifying second I thought I might drop it all over the floor. Behind my father's shoulder, I saw Monica. My older sister leaned back in her chair with a smile curled at the edges, her lips still moist from whispering into his ear just seconds earlier. She avoided my gaze, deliberately sipping her wine as if she had won a game only she understood. My stomach twisted. My chest felt hollow. The taste of smoke from the turkey seemed to crawl into my throat until I could hardly breathe. This was supposed to be a day of gratitude, of family gathering, of remembering my late mother's traditions. Yet, my father had turned it into a trial and delivered the verdict before anyone had spoken in my defense. My Aunt Helen, sitting 2 chairs away, covered her mouth in shock. Ethan, my 22-year-old brother, rolled his eyes, muttered something about always causing drama, and returned to scrolling on his phone, utterly unmoved. I searched the table for any sign of rescue for a single relative who might say, "Thomas, that is too much," but silence pressed down heavier than the steam rising from the mashed potatoes. The candles flickered as if they too had been shaken by the blow. I wanted to disappear into the kitchen to hide behind the oven door and never return, but my knees locked, and I stood there, a statue carved out of humiliation. My father's words echoed in my head, each syllable hammering down like nails. Disgrace, disgrace, disgrace. It was not the first time he had used the word, but never in front of so many eyes, never on a day when the whole extended family gathered. Monica tilted her head, her pearl earrings catching the light, and gave me a smile so triumphant it told me exactly what had happened. She had whispered lies into his ear, and he had believed them without hesitation. The betrayal was not only in the insult, but in the public execution of my dignity. Every dish on the table, every candle, every folded napkin I had prepared, felt like evidence against me, as though my attempt to hold the family together had been ridiculed as pretension. I swallowed hard, the taste of salt mixing with the bitterness in my mouth. Somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered that this was the moment, the line I could never step back over. This dinner would not end with me begging for forgiveness for crimes I had never committed. This Thanksgiving would be remembered not as the day I was humiliated, but as the day the lies that poisoned my family began to unravel. When I was 12 years old, I watched my family fracture along invisible lines that only grew deeper with time. My mother had just passed away after a sudden illness, leaving the house empty of warmth, and from that moment my father Thomas shifted his attention entirely to Monica. She was 16 then, tall, graceful, already favored for her charm, while I was the quiet shadow trailing behind. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with my spelling homework spread out in front of me, hoping he would notice that I had gotten every word correct. Instead, he came in with a new dress he had bought for Monica, holding it up proudly and saying, "Look at my beautiful girl, ready for prom in a few years." He never even glanced at my paper. That night, I lay awake and realized that being smart, being diligent, was not enough to win his eyes. It was Monica's smile that opened every door. The years rolled forward, and every milestone only sharpened the divide. At 14, I earned a certificate for top grades in my class, but my father never attended the ceremony. He told me later he had taken Monica shopping for her debate competition outfit. She returned with bags of new clothes while I clutched my award alone, the applause of teachers ringing hollow without a parent present. I began to understand that Thomas's love was conditional and selective, and the condition was never me. The imbalance grew heavier when Ethan was born. My mother had been gone 2 years by then, and suddenly my father's words revolved around legacy, about how at last he had a son to carry the family name. He introduced Ethan to neighbors with pride I had never seen on his face before. I can still hear him saying, "A daughter's honor lies in her husband's hands, but a son carries the bloodline." Those words carved into my skin like burns. It meant no matter what I achieved, I was secondary, a placeholder until Ethan came of age. At family gatherings, Monica learned to exploit this favoritism with subtle cruelty. She would volunteer to help with chores but whisper accusations about me to our father. Once she told him I had stolen money from his wallet. I was grounded for a week until he later found the cash under his car seat. He never apologized, simply said, "Be more careful next time, Lydia." I knew then that my truth had no weight against her words. When I entered high school, I poured myself into work. Straight A's, part-time jobs, anything to build a life independent of the narrow role my father assigned me. But every time I won something, a scholarship, a commendation, he brushed it off as luck, while Monica's smallest accomplishments were celebrated like miracles. At a church picnic, someone praised me for winning the county essay contest, but Thomas cut in with, "Yes, but have you seen Monica sing? She has real talent." My cheeks burned as laughter rolled around the table, erasing my achievement as if it had never happened. The fracture widened beyond repair one winter night. Snow was falling thick outside, and I had just been accepted into a leadership program. I waited by the window, excited to tell my father. Hours passed until he returned, beaming not for me, but for Monica, who had been crowned homecoming queen. He held her arm, bragging that she would make the family proud. I stood there in silence, acceptance letter hidden in my pocket, realizing that nothing I did could break through the wall of preference that surrounded her. By the time I reached 18, I had stopped hoping for fairness. I worked. I saved. I planned for college with no expectation of help. When I told Thomas I wanted to major in business, he frowned and said, "That's for men. You'll find a husband who can take care of you." Monica giggled beside him, already plotting her next advantage. The message was clear. My role was to shrink, to disappear behind the success stories of my siblings. That belief followed me into adulthood like a chain. Even as I built a career on my own, the echoes of his dismissals rang loud, feeding Monica's arrogance and Ethan's inherited privilege. And so, when I stood at the head of the Thanksgiving table, years later, hearing my father call me a disgrace, it was not an isolated strike. It was the culmination of every ignored award, every insult disguised as tradition, every whispered lie that Monica fed him since the day our mother's chair at the table fell empty. By the time I turned 22, the favoritism in our household had transformed from quiet neglect into open policy. My father, Thomas, no longer pretended to distribute his attention fairly. Every decision he made was filtered through Monica's needs and Ethan's potential. I had graduated college with honors, clutching a business plan for a small coffee shop I dreamed of opening. I spent nights sketching layouts, researching suppliers, calculating margins. When I finally gathered the courage to present it to him, I imagined a spark of pride, maybe a small loan to help me start. He glanced at the folder, skimmed 2 pages, and pushed it back across the table. "Girls waste money, Lydia. Better to save your energy for a family." The rejection hit harder than any slap. He never read the budget projections, never saw the hours I had poured into shaping my independence. The same week, Monica announced she wanted to open a boutique. Without hesitation, Thomas wrote her a check for $50,000. He paraded her idea around to his friends at church, calling her an entrepreneur, the pride of the family. I watched her boutique collapse within a year, racks of unsold clothes gathering dust. Yet my father defended her as if she had pioneered an empire. He called it a learning experience, while my business plan lay forgotten in a drawer. Ethan, meanwhile, was celebrated for the smallest tasks. At 16, he washed Thomas's car and was rewarded with praise as if he had built an engine from scratch. I recall one Sunday dinner when Thomas lifted his glass and declared, "Ethan will carry our name into the future. He will restore the honor of this family." The words pierced me because they implied I, as a daughter, could never carry anything of value. Monica learned to weaponize this bias with mastery. She sowed lies like seeds, each one sprouting into suspicion that clung to me. At a neighborhood barbecue, she whispered to Thomas that I had been seen with a married coworker. He confronted me in front of relatives, his voice filled with disdain, demanding to know how I could shame the family. I denied it, of course, but his eyes were already poisoned. Later, I discovered Monica had orchestrated the rumor, asking a friend to spread it until it reached his ears. The humiliation was deliberate, calculated to keep me beneath her heel. I remember a Christmas when Thomas handed out gifts. Ethan unwrapped a new laptop. Monica received a diamond bracelet. When my turn came, I was handed a plain envelope with a grocery store gift card inside. He muttered, "Practical, just like you." The laughter that followed from Monica and Ethan still echoes in my memory. It wasn't the gift itself, it was the message. My ambitions were invisible, my worth reduced to chores. Still, I refused to collapse. I worked double shifts, saved every dollar, and eventually rented a small corner shop to start my cafe without his support. It thrived modestly, filled with the aroma of fresh beans and the chatter of loyal customers. Yet even then, Monica tried to undermine me. She told Thomas I was laundering money, spreading whispers that my independence was built on dishonesty. He came to my cafe once, not to congratulate me, but to inspect the books, flipping through receipts with suspicion. He left without a word, and I realized the battle for his approval was a war I could never win. The final blow came during a family reunion. I had been invited to speak about young entrepreneurship at a local Chamber of Commerce event. I asked Thomas if he would attend. He shrugged and said he was busy. That evening, I discovered he had gone with Monica to a gala instead. When he returned, he spoke glowingly of her connections, her elegance, her role as the family's shining star. I sat silently, the acceptance speech I had prepared crumpled in my bag, wondering how many more times I would allow myself to be erased. Those years hardened me. They taught me that favoritism was not just unfair, it was corrosive, seeping into every interaction until truth no longer mattered. Monica's lies became scripture to Thomas, while my reality dissolved into shadows. By the time Thanksgiving came around, the stage was already set. One whisper from her lips was enough to ignite his condemnation. And as I stood at that table hearing the word disgrace spill from his mouth, I understood it was the natural crescendo of years of bias, lies, and betrayal. The morning of Thanksgiving dawned cold and gray, the kind of November sky that promised snow but held it back just enough to leave the air heavy with anticipation. I had risen before sunrise, sliding a 20-pound turkey into the oven, basting it every hour until the skin gleamed golden. My small house smelled of rosemary and butter, a warmth I hoped would soften the sharp edges of our family history. Hosting Thanksgiving had been my idea. My attempt to stitch together the frayed seams of our bond. Maybe if I welcomed them into my space, surrounded them with food and effort, they would see me not as the outsider, but as the daughter who still cared. By noon, the table was set with my mother's china, the delicate plates she had once polished until they shone. I ironed the napkins, lit cream-colored candles, and placed a framed photo of her on the sideboard. It was my silent gesture, a reminder that once we had been whole and that I still honored her memory. When the doorbell rang, I smoothed my apron and greeted each relative with a smile I forced into place. Monica swept in first, draped in a fur-lined coat, her perfume saturating the hallway before she even spoke. Behind her, my father Thomas carried a bottle of wine, his face already stern, as though arriving at my home was a duty, not a gift. Ethan trailed with headphones around his neck, muttering a greeting without lifting his eyes from his phone. For a while, things seemed manageable. Relatives chatted in the living room, the football game hummed from the television, and the children darted through the kitchen begging for cookies. Monica sat near my father, her hand lightly on his arm, whispering now and then while casting sideways glances at me. Each time his expression tightened. I tried to ignore it, focusing on carving the turkey, arranging sweet potatoes, and reminding myself that today was about gratitude, not conflict. We gathered around the long table just before 3 o'clock plates piled high, glasses filled. My heart pounded as I looked at Thomas, praying he would acknowledge my effort. He stood wine glass raised, and the room hushed in expectation of a blessing. For one fleeting breath, I imagined him saying, "Lydia, thank you, you brought us together." Instead, his lips curved downward and he announced with measured cruelty, "Lydia, you are a disgrace." The words slammed into me harder than I thought possible. My vision blurred. My hands shook around the serving tray. A murmur spread across the table. Children fell silent. My Aunt Helen's fork clattered against her plate. I tried to breathe, but the air stuck in my throat. Across from me, Monica leaned back, sipping her wine, her eyes glittering with triumph. I saw it then, the subtle tilts of her head, earlier the whispers into Thomas's ear, the calculated pauses before his glare shifted toward me. She had fed him something poisonous, and he had swallowed it whole. The humiliation wasn't just in the insult, but in the setting. My home, my table, my mother's dishes all turned into a stage for my father's condemnation. Every candle I had lit, every pie I had baked now mocked me symbols of a love that would never be reciprocated. My relatives shifted uncomfortably, some looking down at their plates, others stealing pitying glances in my direction. No one spoke. Not even Ethan, who smirked briefly before retreating back into his phone. I felt tears sting my eyes, but refused to let them fall. I clenched my jaw and told myself I would not collapse here, not in front of Monica's smile or Thomas's scowl. This was the spark, the moment when years of buried pain ignited. I placed the tray down gently, forcing steadiness into my voice as I said, "Enjoy the meal." Inside, though, a storm raged. I knew I could not let this night pass like all the others, swallowed by silence. Monica's lies had crossed into my sanctuary, and Thomas had branded me in front of everyone. Something had to break, and it would not be me. The silence after my father's words stretched unbearably long, a suffocating pause broken only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. My hands pressed against the edge of the table, steadying myself while heat burned behind my eyes. Then I felt it, a gentle touch on my arm. Aunt Helen. My mother's older sister leaned closer, her voice low but firm enough for those nearby to hear. "Don't let them write your story, Lydia," she whispered, her gray eyes locked on mine with an intensity that steadied my breath. Helen had always been different from the rest of the family. At 60, unmarried and childless, she was often dismissed by Thomas as a woman who never fulfilled her duty. Growing up, I watched him mock her independence, calling it loneliness. Yet she was the only adult who ever slipped me a $20 bill for books, who called on birthdays, who asked how my classes were going. Her presence at my table that night was more than symbolic. It was a reminder that someone believed me worthy. She pushed back her chair, the sound sharp in the hush, and stood. "Thomas," she said, her voice calm but cutting, "I think you owe Lydia an explanation. This is her home, her table, and she has welcomed us all." Gasps rose softly around the table. No one usually challenged my father, not in public. His face hardened, his jaw tightening as he retorted, "Stay out of this, Helen. You wouldn't understand." But she didn't flinch. "I understand more than you think," she replied. "I understand what it feels like to be diminished because I wasn't born a son, or because I didn't give you grandchildren to parade, and I won't watch you do to Lydia what you've done to me for decades." Her words hung in the air like a crack of thunder. My chest tightened, gratitude swelling in a place where pain had lived too long. Monica shifted uncomfortably, her glass pausing halfway to her lips. For a second, the confidence in her eyes faltered. She murmured, "He's only telling the truth," but the conviction in her voice wavered. Helen turned on her sharp as a blade. "The truth, Monica, or the stories you've been whispering?" A ripple of murmurs traveled around the table. A cousin glanced at Monica with raised brows, suspicion flickering for the first time. I inhaled, deeply steadied by Helen's courage. For years, I had shouldered the weight of silence, convinced that speaking up would only worsen the divide. But Helen had cracked the surface, and light was seeping through. She reached for my hand under the table, squeezed it once, and mouthed, "You're not alone." That squeeze ignited something inside me, a small flame of defiance. I sat taller, wiping the moisture from my eyes, and looked directly at my father. "If I am a disgrace," I said softly, "then you should know why you believe it, because I know the words aren't yours, not really. They were put there." Thomas bristled, his face reddening, but he didn't answer. Monica's nails tapped nervously against her glass. The room leaned closer, every relative sensing a fracture in the script they had been fed. Helen sat back down, slowly satisfied that she had shifted the balance. She lifted her fork and pierced a slice of turkey, chewing with deliberate calm, as if to say, "The stage is yours now, Lydia." I looked around the table at the eyes fixed on me, some sympathetic, some doubtful, some waiting for the spectacle to unfold. My heart pounded, but for the first time that night, I wasn't afraid. Helen had given me the strength I needed, and I knew exactly what I would do next. My fork hovered above the mashed potatoes, but my appetite had long vanished. A tremor of fury coursed through me, not the kind that burns and fades, but the slow, simmering kind that seeks an outlet. Helen's words had cracked the veneer of Thomas's authority, and now I had the choice. Retreat into silence again, or bring out the truth I had been guarding for months. My pulse drummed in my ears as I made the decision. I would not let Monica's lies remain unchallenged, not this time, not in my own home. I excused myself quietly, slipping into the living room where my laptop sat charging on the side table. My fingers shook as I carried it back into the dining room, the weight of it heavier than the turkey I had lifted hours earlier. Conversations faltered as relatives watched me set it at the end of the table. Monica's eyes narrowed, suspicion flashing. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice sharp. I met her gaze steady now. "If I am a disgrace, then everyone here deserves to know why my father believes it." With a few keystrokes, I projected the screen onto the flat-screen TV mounted on the wall, where usually football played on Thanksgiving afternoons. Instead, a folder labeled Receipts opened. I heard an audible intake of breath from several cousins. The first file, a chain of emails Monica had sent to my former supervisor, disguised under a fake address but carelessly signed with her initials. She claimed I was romantically involved with a married colleague, that I manipulated schedules for personal gain. My supervisor, a cautious man, had forwarded them to HR. Though the accusation was dismissed, the shadow of suspicion had lingered, gnawing at my professional reputation. I displayed the header, the timestamps, the digital signature that linked back to Monica's home IP address. A murmur of disbelief rose around the table. "Those are fake!" Monica snapped, her knuckles whitening around the stem of her wine glass, but her voice cracked on the last word. Next, I opened a voicemail recording. Thomas's voice filled the room, tinny but clear. "Monica told me you slept your way to that promotion, Lydia. How could you shame us like this?" The silence afterward, my father's heavy breathing, and then the abrupt click of disconnection echoed against the walls. I watched Thomas's face blanch as the sound of his own words returned to haunt him. He started to speak, but faltered, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Finally, I revealed the bank transfers. Rows of numbers appeared on the screen, Thomas wiring $50,000 to Monica under the label Business Support. But in the family accounting records, the note had been altered to read Support for Lydia's Cafe. To anyone outside, it looked like I had squandered the money he gave me, when in reality I had never seen a cent. My actual cafe had been built from years of double shifts and sleepless nights, not from his supposed generosity. The manipulation was clear. Monica had taken the funds, Thomas had signed the paperwork, and my name had been attached as the scapegoat. Gasps circled the room. One uncle muttered, "I knew something was off." A cousin shook her head, glaring at Monica. The children, sensing the tension, whispered to each other in wide-eyed confusion. Monica slammed her glass down so hard, red wine splashed across the linen tablecloth. "This is ridiculous," she hissed. "She's twisting everything. You all know Lydia's always been jealous." But before anyone could respond, a knock sounded at the front door. Every head turned. My chest tightened. I knew who it was. I had sent the message earlier, unsure if I would ever have the courage to follow through. Now the timing felt ordained. I walked to the door and opened it. There stood Mark Carter, my lawyer, in a crisp suit that contrasted with the warmth of the Thanksgiving chaos inside. He held a slim leather briefcase. "Sorry for the interruption," he said, politely stepping in. His eyes swept across the stunned faces, landing finally on Thomas. "I'm here because Lydia asked me to verify some documents. She wanted the truth to be clear." Monica's face drained of color. "You brought a lawyer to Thanksgiving," she spat. Mark's voice was calm, measured, authoritative. "Only because the lies have reached the point of legal consequence." He laid papers on the table, notarized confirmations from the bank metadata analysis proving the emails originated from Monica's account, and HR records dismissing the false complaints against me. "These are not interpretations," he said. "These are facts. And facts have weight in court whether whispered lies do or not." The room was electric, every eye bouncing between Monica's clenched jaw, Thomas's reddening face, and my steady posture. My Aunt Helen leaned back, her expression a mixture of pride and relief. For the first time in years, I felt the ground shift beneath Monica's feet, not mine. I spoke then, my voice strong. "For years, I've been called troublemaker, liar, disgrace. But tonight, you see the truth. The disgrace isn't mine to carry." My words hung heavy, undeniable. Thomas finally stood his chair, scraping harshly. His voice trembled, anger mixing with shame. "Monica, tell me this isn't true." But the evidence lay open, undeniable, and silence was the only answer she could muster. That silence was louder than any confession. The dining room, once filled with the smell of turkey and the hum of conversation, now carried only tension so thick it pressed on my chest. The projector screen still glowed on the wall rows of bank transfers frozen in place like scars carved into light. No one reached for their forks anymore. Candles guttered in their holders, wax spilling in slow rivers as if even they wilted beneath the weight of revelation. I stood at the end of the table, my laptop before me, the truth laid bare for all to see. Thomas's hand trembled around his wine glass. His voice, once booming with certainty, faltered. "Monica," he said again, "tell me this isn't true." His words were half a command, half a plea, as though clinging to the belief that the daughter he had adored could not possibly have orchestrated such betrayal. Monica's eyes darted left and right, searching for sympathy that no longer existed. A cousin shifted uncomfortably, another shook her head, and even Ethan finally tore his gaze from his phone, his expression somewhere between shock and disbelief. Monica slammed her hand against the table. "It's not what it looks like. Lydia doctored these files. She's desperate for attention, just like always." Mark Carter, standing calmly with his briefcase, adjusted his glasses. These records were verified by the bank and by a certified IT forensic specialist. "Nothing here is fabricated." His tone was professional, stripped of emotion, yet its authority was undeniable. Monica's face flushed red. She turned her fury on me. "How dare you bring an outsider into our family dinner? Do you want to humiliate us in front of everyone?" I met her glare without flinching. "I didn't bring humiliation. You did the moment you decided my reputation was disposable. You whispered lies for years and he believed you. Tonight, I simply put your whispers into light." Gasps rippled across the table. Aunt Helen leaned forward, her eyes fierce. "She's right. Monica, you've manipulated this family long enough. We've all seen it, but tonight we can't deny it anymore." Thomas's face twisted with conflict. His voice cracked as he asked, "Why, Monica? Why would you do this to your sister?" Monica's composure finally cracked. Her laugh was sharp, bitter. "Because she doesn't deserve what she has. She acts like she's better than us, running her little cafe thinking she can stand without you. I made sure you remembered who the real daughter is. You always said I was your pride. I just made sure it stayed that way." The confession, raw and venomous, dropped like a stone in water. Relatives shifted in their seats, some murmuring prayers, others glaring in disgust. Ethan muttered, "This is insane," but even he couldn't defend her now. Thomas staggered back a step, the weight of her words crushing him. For years he had chosen her side, blindly convinced that loyalty to Monica was loyalty to truth. Now the illusion crumbled before everyone's eyes. His glass slipped from his hand, shattering across the hardwood floor. I took a breath, my voice steady, though my heart thundered. "You called me a disgrace, Father, but tell me what is more disgraceful: building something with my own hands or destroying it with lies. Cooking this meal for all of you or poisoning your ear with venom. I've carried shame that never belonged to me. Tonight, I give it back." The room erupted. Some relatives voiced support. "She's right, Thomas," while others muttered prayers under their breath. The children were ushered out by worried parents. Monica's composure dissolved into shrieks. "You're all fools if you believe her. She's nothing without me, without us." Helen rose from her seat, her voice firm. "Enough. This has gone on too long. Lydia deserves respect. And you, Monica, must face the consequences of your choices." Mark Carter cleared his throat, producing a final document from his briefcase. "As Lydia's counsel, I must inform you that this evidence has already been filed with the appropriate authorities. Charges of defamation and financial misrepresentation are pending. Tonight is not a performance. It is a reckoning." Monica's eyes widened in horror. "You wouldn't dare!" But I did, and I had. Thomas sank into his chair, head in his hands. For the first time, he seemed small, the authority stripped away, leaving only a man confronted by his own blindness. "What have I done?" he whispered, though I wasn't sure if he spoke to me, to Monica, or to himself. I stepped closer, not in anger, but in clarity. "You let your son's gender blind you, and your favorite daughter's whispers define me. But I am done living beneath that shadow. I will not ask for your approval. I will not carry your disgrace. From tonight on, I belong only to the truth." The words settled into silence so profound it seemed to erase the clinking of cutlery, the hum of the refrigerator, even the ticking of the clock. One by one, relatives rose from the table, their plates untouched, and walked to my side. Cousins, uncles, aunts, standing beside me, a quiet show of solidarity. Helen placed her hand on my shoulder, a steady anchor in the storm. Monica screamed a sound shrill with desperation. "You'll regret this, all of you!" She grabbed her coat, stormed toward the door, and slammed it behind her, leaving only the echoes of broken glass and shattered lies in her wake. The confrontation was over, but the consequences had only begun. The slam of the front door echoed through the house like a gunshot rattling the picture frames on the walls. For a moment, no one moved. Monica's perfume lingered faintly in the air, cloying and sharp, a ghost of her presence that refused to dissipate. My father Thomas sat slumped in his chair, his head bowed into his hands as if the weight of the past years had suddenly collapsed onto his shoulders. The authority he had worn like armor seemed cracked, flimsy, no longer impenetrable. Around the table, relatives whispered, their voices hushed but urgent. The word disgrace still hung in the air, but now its ownership had shifted. Mark Carter closed his briefcase with a click that sliced through the silence. "I'll leave these copies with you," he said, laying neatly bound packets of documents on the table. "The financial misrepresentation and fraudulent transfers are serious. I've already filed preliminary motions with the county court. Lydia's name has been cleared from the records, but Monica will be summoned to account for the funds." His calm tone carried the weight of finality. Gasps rippled again through the room. One uncle muttered, "So she really stole—" Another shook his head in disbelief. My Aunt Helen leaned toward me, squeezing my arm. "You were right to prepare, Lydia. You were right not to stay silent." Thomas finally lifted his face, his eyes bloodshot, his jaw quivering. "Court fraud. Do you realize what this will do to our name?" His words trembled between outrage and despair. I straightened, my voice steady. "Our name was already damaged, Father. Not by me. By the lies you chose to believe and the money you let vanish into Monica's hands. The disgrace isn't mine to carry. It's hers and yours for enabling it." He flinched as though struck. For a moment, I thought he might lash out, but then his shoulders sagged and he looked older than I had ever seen him. "I thought I was protecting this family," he whispered. "I thought." His voice trailed off into silence, swallowed by the truth laid bare before him. That weekend, papers were served. Monica received notice of pending charges, defamation, fraud, and financial misrepresentation. Word spread quickly through the community. The boutique she had opened with fanfare became the subject of gossip and scorn. Suppliers demanded repayment. Former friends withdrew invitations. The social standing she had polished so carefully shattered overnight. Meanwhile, my cafe became a symbol of resilience. Customers came not only for coffee, but for conversation, offering words of support and admiration. Some brought their friends, others their parents, saying they wanted to stand behind a woman who had faced betrayal and stood tall. Business grew not through pity, but through respect. Thomas, however, faced a different reckoning. At church the following Sunday, people whispered behind their hymnals. A deacon approached him directly, asking, "How could you let this happen under your roof?" The man who once relished community praise now endured public judgment. He withdrew, skipping services, avoiding gatherings haunted by the collapse of the image he had spent a lifetime constructing. At home, the silence was worse. Ethan, embarrassed by the scandal, moved in with friends. Monica's absence left a void Thomas could not ignore. He called me once, his voice tired, asking if I could come talk, but I declined. "Not now," I said. "Respect is earned and you've not yet started earning mine." The line went dead heavy with unspoken regret. Monica's downfall accelerated. In court, the evidence was undeniable. The altered financial records, the emails, the voicemail all painted a picture of deliberate manipulation. She tried to twist the narrative, blaming stress, blaming jealousy, even blaming me for provoking her, but the judge's patience wore thin. A restitution order was issued. Monica was required to repay tens of thousands, stripped of credibility in the community and disinherited from my father's estate. Watching her crumble was not the triumph I had imagined. There was no joy in her humiliation, only a deep, weary relief that the truth had finally spoken louder than her whispers. Justice was not sweet, it was sobering. It reminded me how much had been lost before it was won. At the close of the hearing, as people filtered from the courtroom, Monica turned to me with eyes brimming not with sorrow, but with venom. "You'll regret this, Lydia," she hissed, but her voice no longer held power. The court transcript, the signatures, the restitution order, they were stronger than her threats. I walked away without answering, each step lighter than the last. For Thomas, the twist was harder still. He tried to visit me one evening, standing on the doorstep of my cafe, his figure hunched against the cold. I watched him through the glass, struggling with the decision. At last, I stepped outside the winter air, biting at my cheeks. "Lydia," he began, his voice rough. "I was blind. I failed you." His words trembled with something close to apology, but I held up a hand. "Father, I don't need apologies whispered in the dark," I said. "I need actions, truth, consistency. I don't know if you can give me that. Until you prove it, my life moves forward without your approval." His shoulders sagged further. He nodded once slowly and walked away. That was the twist of justice, not just Monica's downfall, but the mirror it forced my father to face. He had to live with the consequences of his favoritism, his blind belief in whispers. And I finally lived without the weight of his judgment. Winter settled in hard that year, the kind that coated the cafe windows with frost and painted the sidewalks silver under street lamps. Inside, warmth pulsed through the air. Espresso machines, hissing chatter, humming the smell of cinnamon and baked bread curling into every corner. My cafe had become more than a business. It was a sanctuary. Customers who once knew me only as the quiet daughter in a fractured family now greeted me by name, offering smiles that felt genuine, untainted by pity or suspicion. The legal outcome cemented the shift. Monica's fraud case concluded with a court order restitution of $52,000 to be repaid in installments, mandatory community service, and a formal record of defamation against her name. She fought bitterly in hearings, her voice rising in desperation, but every time the evidence stood taller. By the final ruling, her defiance had collapsed into silence. When the judge pronounced the sentence, she didn't look at me. She stared at the floor, as if refusing to acknowledge the sister who had finally broken her hold. The boutique she once bragged about shuttered within weeks. Empty mannequins stood behind dusty glass, the for lease sign a public declaration of her fall. Friends who once crowded her parties disappeared, unwilling to risk their reputations by standing at her side. Monica faded into a shadow of herself, muttering venom when paths crossed, but powerless to wound. For Thomas, the consequences unfolded slower, more insidious. He had not been charged with any crime. His signature on the altered records had been chalked up to negligence rather than intent. But the court of public opinion was merciless. At church, parishioners no longer approached him for advice. At community gatherings, conversations hushed when he entered. A man who once thrived on authority now lived beneath a cloud of shame. He called me again after the verdict, his voice weary. "Lydia," he said, "I've lost both of my daughters. One to lies, one to truth. And it's my own fault." His admission carried sorrow, yet I didn't rush to soothe him. Instead, I let the silence hang before answering. "You haven't lost me," I said. "You gave me up long ago when you chose favoritism over fairness. Now, you're simply living with the truth you ignored." He said nothing more, only sighed before hanging up. Ethan, the youngest, kept his distance at first. For weeks, he avoided me, embarrassed by the scandal that bore our family name. But one evening, he appeared at the cafe, shifting awkwardly in the doorway before ordering a black coffee. We sat in silence until he finally blurted, "I'm sorry. I didn't know how bad it was for you." His apology was hesitant but real, and I accepted it. "You don't have to carry their mistakes," I told him. "But you do have to decide what kind of brother you'll be." He nodded, uncertain, but listening. Aunt Helen remained my anchor. She visited the cafe often, bringing her knitting, claiming she liked the noise. But I knew better she came because she refused to let me stand alone. "You remind me of your mother," she told me one evening, her needles clicking softly. "Strong, stubborn, unwilling to let injustice define you. She would be proud." The words lodged deep in my chest, warming a place I hadn't realized was still cold. Financially, I thrived. The scandal ironically drew more customers, people curious about the woman who had stood up to her family and won. But I made sure success didn't twist into vengeance. My menu carried names that honored resilience, the Phoenix Latte Second Chance Brew. Every cup served wasn't just coffee, it was a quiet reminder that dignity could be reclaimed. For Monica, the outcome was exile. For Thomas, humiliation. For Ethan, a chance at redemption. For me, a new chapter defined not by whispers or favoritism, but by truth. The clear outcome was not just who lost or who won, it was the reshaping of boundaries. I no longer sought approval from those unwilling to give it honestly. I no longer carried blame that was never mine. Justice had not restored the family I once dreamed of, but it had freed me to build something truer. And freedom, I realized, was the outcome worth fighting for all along. A year has passed since that Thanksgiving night, but sometimes when the wind howls through the trees and rattles the windows of my cafe, I can still hear the echo of my father's voice calling me a disgrace. The word no longer pierces me as it once did. Instead, it feels like a reminder of how far I've traveled from that table, from that life defined by whispers and favoritism. The cafe has grown into something I never dared to imagine. What began as a modest corner shop now pulses with steady life, mornings filled with commuters clutching their lattes, afternoons buzzing with students bent over laptops, evenings lit by the low murmur of neighbors swapping stories. I host open mic nights twice a month where young poets and weary workers share their voices, and every December I hold a toy drive in memory of my mother, whose quiet kindness remains my guiding star. The name on the window reads Helen's Hearth. It was Aunt Helen's idea. At first, I resisted thinking it too sentimental, but she insisted. "This cafe isn't just yours," she said. "It's proof that family isn't who whispers lies in the dark. It's who stands in the light with you." She still sits in her favorite corner most mornings, knitting scarves she donates to the shelter downtown, watching with pride as the place fills. Monica drifts at the edges of my awareness, a figure I no longer chase nor fear. She repaid part of the restitution, but defaulted soon after forcing the court to seize assets. Last I heard, she moved 2 towns over, her reputation trailing like a shadow she can't escape. I don't hate her anymore. Hate is heavy, and I've carried enough weights in my life. She is simply gone from my world, and that absence is its own kind of justice. Thomas remains in the same house, though it feels like a stranger's home now. I see him occasionally at the market, his hair grayer, his step slower, his once proud shoulders bowed. He approaches, sometimes speaking gently, almost reverently. "Lydia," he'll say, "I'm proud of what you've built." The words come too late, but they are honest, and I accept them as fragments of peace. I don't know if we will ever rebuild what was broken, but I no longer ache for his approval. My dignity is whole without it. Ethan visits more often now. He helps with deliveries, sometimes lingers to chat with customers. Slowly, cautiously, we are stitching together the bond siblings are meant to share. He doesn't always know what to say, but he shows up, and that is more than enough. Looking back, the greatest twist was not Monica's downfall or even the courtroom's judgment. It was the discovery that justice, once stripped of drama and venom, is quiet. It is the steady rhythm of a life no longer defined by lies. It is choosing peace over resentment, boundaries over blind loyalty, truth over silence. On the anniversary of that Thanksgiving, I closed the cafe early and invited friends and customers to share a meal. We pushed tables together, laughter rising as plates clattered, children darted between chairs. Helen raised her glass and said, "To Lydia for showing us that dignity is not given, it's claimed." The cheer that followed wrapped around me like a quilt. I realized then that I had built more than a cafe. I had built a family not bound by blood but by presence, respect, and truth. If there is a lesson etched into this past year, it is this: family is not always who you are born to. Family is who refuses to let you stand alone. And when you choose to live in truth, even if it costs you the approval of those who should have loved you, you gain something far greater yourself. I locked up that night under a clear sky, stars sharp against the cold. As I walked home, the word disgrace floated into my mind once more, and I almost laughed. It no longer belonged to me. It never had. Sometimes life teaches us the hardest lessons, not in quiet classrooms, but at the family table in front of those we thought would always stand with us. For me, the word disgrace once cut like a knife. But over time, I learned that disgrace doesn't come from others' whispers. It comes from abandoning the truth inside yourself. When I chose to stand in the light, even if it meant standing alone, I discovered something powerful. Real family are the people who show up, not just those who share your blood. If you're watching this and you've lived through betrayal or favoritism in your own family, know this: you are not defined by their blindness. Dignity can be reclaimed at any age, and justice, whether in court or in your own heart, will always find its way. I share my story because so many in our community, especially those of us over 50, have carried silent wounds for too long. But healing begins when we speak. So I invite you, share in the comments. Have you faced a moment where you had to choose truth over family approval? If my story resonated with you, please give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you never miss the next story. And don't forget to tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to know. Together we're building not just an audience but a chosen family.